to Prolespod.
Hello and welcome to Prolespod, your bi-weekly dose of history without the liberalism. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at Prolespod. If you want to help us reach more people, please leave 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers. If you want to extra support us, you can also subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/Prolespod. There's a lot of great stuff there, such as access to exclusive limited time merch, bonus episodes, early access, listening to live recording sessions, with much more on the way. This episode is brought to you by Air Baltic, which has gifted us with these totally scandal-free, unlimited amount of air miles.
We're taking that Iron Curtain tour, guys.
Today we're going to be talking about a very specific time of Latvia's history during its Soviet period. We're going to be learning about its Red Partisans during World War II. But before we get to that, who do we have here with us today?
Got Jeremy.
Justin.
Taylor here.
Sweet boy Taylor.
Our subject matter expert today is Iskolat, who previously was featured on 2 episodes on my other podcast, Actually Existing Socialism, where we do a deep dive into Latvia's socialist history. Those episodes are called Latvia 101 and Latvia 102. It's great to chat with you again. Iskolat, do you want to give us a brief introduction to yourself and the work that you do?
Sure, thank you. Of course, I would give a recap to those comrades who are just tuning in and those, for example, who missed the previous podcast. And of course, you should definitely check it out if you have the time. So in short, I am one of the communists who are active in Latvia. So a few years ago, we had a relatively big organization that was known in public space, and it was called the Workers' Front of Latvia. And a few months ago, it was officially banned by the Latvian authorities. So the situation for us became a lot more serious in 2022 after another round of escalation in Ukraine. And obviously, the capitalist authorities all over the world used that as an excuse to pursue any kind of opposition or anti-capitalist views by trying to tie them to the Russian aggression or whatever. So obviously, it's just an excuse to capitalism to put a lid on all revolutionary and progressive movements. So first,
I thought really that all of the oppression was under the Soviet Union. I thought that now that the Soviet Union no longer had its boot on the Baltic states' necks, that everybody was free there. You have freedom of speech and all that, right?
No? We're overdosing on freedom and democracy right now. So to give you a brief recap of how tough the situation in Latvia is. So the communist parties in all 3 Baltic republics were immediately banned after the counter-revolution won in 1990 and 1991. A lot of prominent communists and pro-Soviet activists were thrown into jail or simply exiled. They were forced to leave. And a lot of people were deprived of their citizenship. So in Estonia and Latvia, we have a wholesale apartheid system. We have this non-citizen system. And those people who, for example, immigrated into Latvia and Estonia after 1940 and 1945, they were automatically stripped of their citizenship based on ethnic lineage. And all those people who participated in any communist organization or otherwise resisted the counter-revolution were all also deprived of their citizenship. And before 1998, there was no way to get naturalized, so to speak, to gain your citizenship back. That was taken away in the first place. But under international pressure, they introduced this naturalization exam where you had to pass this language test, where you had to pledge loyalty to the new nationalist government. And even then, they can take away your citizenship at any time for anti-government activity because it was gained through naturalization. So they treat you as less than immigrant because foreign citizens and people with residency permits have more rights than non-citizens because non-citizens, they cannot vote, they cannot get elected, they cannot become government employees, they cannot become policemen or firemen or rescue workers. And they also cannot become attorneys or lawyers or any kind of occupation that is related to law. And they also cannot buy specific parcels of land, especially the ones that are close to the border. And they also had dozens and dozens of limitations. So they cannot buy weapons. And up until recently, they were at a disadvantage when applying to universities and jobs. They were always moved to the bottom of the pile.
And this applies to both like people who arrived after 1940 or 1945 and like active members of the Communist Party.
Yes, and it's even tougher for the members of the Communist Party because they cannot get rid of this status. So citizenship is prohibited to them outright. They just cannot do it. So if you were in the Communist Party, the Communist Youth, or the International Front, you are permanently barred from Latvian citizenship. And because of that, thousands of people applied for Russian citizenship instead because they could get at least some rights. For example, they can vote in municipal elections, for example. Non-citizens can't even do that in Latvia.
Wow.
And they simply wanted to at least have some decent standard of living because the Russian pensions at the time used to be pretty substantial. And with some legal loopholes, you could get two pensions at once. And in our country, where prices are extremely high, right now they're higher than in Germany, this was a viable way for a lot of people to just get by, to survive. And after 2022, the nationalist regime of Latvia has embarked on a new discriminatory campaign. They're submitting all of the people with Russian citizenship with permanent residency permits. They're subjecting them to these language tests. So we roughly have 25,000 people with Russian citizenship on permanent permits. And these residency permits were suddenly discontinued. They were canceled. And the government said, you have to pass this language and loyalty test in under 1 year, or else you get deported. So many of these people who receive Russian citizenship, they are already in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s, because it was 30 years ago when they got their citizenship. And many of these people are simply sick. They cannot physically come to these exams and these tests. And many of them are stroke victims. They have conditions. And for example, many of them can't speak, let alone write. So around 12,000 people are subjected to potential deportations. So their residency permits are now canceled. And right now they cannot get health coverage that is funded by the state. And if they're ever caught by the authorities, they will get deported. And right now they're already deporting dozens of people. So they're randomly finding them when these people try to get some sort of service, for example, health coverage. And they're just deporting them to the border. They're just packing them into buses. And they simply offload them at the border checkpoint at the Russian border. So this is a...
I was just going to say, so basically the government forces people to take Russian citizenship in order just to have
live.
just basic living standards, and then turns around and punishes them for getting Russian citizenship.
Yeah, exactly.
Not offering them an alternative.
Yeah, exactly. Without offering any alternative, without any desire to compromise. And of course, many non-citizens just refuse to be subjected to these language tests on principle because it is unfair, it is discriminatory, and it is fascistic to pretty much beg them on their knees to give back the citizenship that they took away in 1991. And these creators of the citizenship law, most of them are emigres. They're white emigres. They're Nazi emigres who emigrated from the country in 1944 when the Red Army was closing in. They settled in countries like Sweden, the US, Canada, Australia, etc. And many of them had overt Nazi ties, and they and their descendants, when they came back in the 1980s, 1990s, they immediately started implementing these draconian citizenship laws, these privatization laws. And one more thing, this is very important. Another main reason, not only it's the ethnic hatred, but the most important aspect is the class aspect, because the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of those people who became non-citizens, they were factory workers. They were very organized factory workers who were working at these huge enterprises, and they were very, very organized. So the nationalist elite understood that these people could seriously influence politics or even create a socialist return policies. For example, they could even pretty much overthrow the government, like it happened in Belarus, where a lot of pro-Soviet people managed to roll back all these capitalist anti-reforms. And because of that, they deprived all these factory workers of their citizenship. And this was a very, very organized force. And for the same reason, the nationalist elite started destroying all these huge factories, all these huge collectives, because they employed thousands and thousands of people simultaneously. And all these organized collectives had a lot of bargaining power. They were in labor unions, they were very educated, and they were very organized. And if they could privatize and dismantle all of these huge factories and enterprises, this would deal a colossal blow to the labor union. And that's exactly what they did with their privatization voucher policy and their non-citizenship policy. So they basically covered them from both fronts, from the political front, because the people affected could not vote and could not get elected. So basically you had this form of fascistic democracy where basically everyone you don't like is simply excluded from politics and only your supporters can vote. And the second is the economic one. So you simultaneously got rid of the organized collectives and organized labor unions who could not bargain for more power for the workers. And that is how they managed to get these shock therapy policies in the 1990s that seriously hurt Latvia.
Yeah. So Iskolat, thanks so much for giving us kind of a brief overview of some of the current issues. To clarify something for our listeners, it's my daughter. Is that on my other podcast, Actually Existing Socialism, Iskolat joined for 2 episodes and kind of give a run through.
It's okay.
To give a run through of Latvia's socialist history throughout the 20th century, from the beginning to the fall. So Iskolat, could you kind of give us that history of why Latvia is the way it is today? And can you take that history back to World War II for us with the Red Partisans?
Yes, because that is the main topic of our talk. And obviously, it was pretty much, a pivotal moment because it was called World War. But here it is more often called the Great Patriotic War. And my Russian comrade recommended that we say the Great Patriotic Class War because it was that important. Because essentially, it was the continuation of the Russian Revolution. And after all these undercover and economic attempts of subjugation failed, imperialism sent its bloodhound, the German fascist entity, in order to try and destroy the revolution. And thankfully, this failed. So again, they changed their tactics and used more subversive ways of using all these bourgeois elements, all these hostile class elements to topple socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat. But that's...
And the reality is that back in, we imagine the Allies, the United States and Great Britain and the Soviet Union as being unified against the Nazis. But the reality is that Stalin begged Churchill to open a Western front so that they could basically, in a pincer move, destroy the German fascists all at once. And this was, way early on. And Churchill kept, sort of pushing it back and not responding. And of course, having a Germany which controlled most of Europe would be bad for business in Britain. But they were also quite interested in destroying the Soviet Union using Germany. So this was a logical decision on their part, but also very, contrary to a lot of the mythology that exists, especially around Churchill, who was a monster.
Yes, that was their intent. So on one part, on one hand, they did not want a complete German victory because that meant the end for the British imperialism. But on the other hand, they wanted to inflict as much damage on the Soviet Union as possible. So they stalled whenever they could and tried to delay the opening of the Second Front. And if you read Stalin's book on the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, than there, he stated as early as late 1941, early 1942, that the Second Front was pivotal in order to offload the brunt of the German offensive off the Soviet Union and hasten the defeat on Germany, because it was historically proven that Germany is not able to fight a war on two fronts. And to go back to our main topic, the partisan and anti-Nazi resistance movement in Latvia, I have to briefly touch down on the socialist revolution in 1940 that took out the fascist regime of Kārlis Ulmanis, the fascist tyrant of Latvia. So in 1919, with the help of the British and German imperialism, the first Latvian Socialist Republic was crushed by the reaction, and the nationalist dictatorship followed soon after. It was a very difficult period for the communists because the Communist Party was outlawed then as well, and they had to do all of their work underground. And they had to use all sorts of tricks in order to be legally represented by labor unions and various associations and to spread influence as much as they could. The communist momentum was very strong after the Great Depression. And with the looming threat of the Nazi invasion, the communists worked hard in order to prevent a complete Nazi takeover, because the Baltic regimes were closely aligned with Hitler and were counting on his support to suppress the growing communist movement. And the Baltics also would act as a very, very important springboard for the invasion of the Soviet Union, because they were very, very close to the main industrial and agricultural areas of the Soviet Union. So the Volga Valley, and most importantly, the city of Leningrad, because it is less than 100 kilometers away from the Estonian border. That is why this Baltic springboard was and is very important for imperialism even to this day. So by 1940, the situation becomes critical, because after the global conflict between the British and German imperialists boils over, the Baltic regimes lose much of their export markets. So demand shrinks and nobody wants to buy their goods anymore. And because of that, economic collapse happens. A lot of people get either fired or transferred to 3-day or 4-day work weeks with no additional pay. And because of that, the communist support rises steadily. And after some hesitation, the Baltic nationalists signed trade agreements with the Soviet Union to prevent a complete economic collapse. So the Soviet Union agrees to pay for these export goods. And after a while, the Soviet Union pushes for a military presence in the Baltics, because they understand that without the Soviet support, the Baltics would collapse. But at the same time, the Baltics are forced to do this because they have both the external pressure of the Soviet Union and the internal pressure of the communist movement. And before World War II, the Soviet Union was actually pretty reluctant, because it knew that it could not provoke the Baltic states before it was ready, because they sort of had to wait, and they had to split their enemies. They had to separate the British imperialism from the German imperialism, and they had to split their enemies. And that is why the Soviet diplomacy during World War II was so effective, because they essentially forced imperialism, the British and American imperialism, into a corner. And the Soviet Union provided them with no other alternative than to ally with the Soviet Union. Because what the British and Americans wanted to do, they wanted to act as a unified front together with the Nazis against the Soviet Union. And thankfully, this attempt failed. And that is why the Soviet Union came out victorious, because it knew how to play to the disadvantages of imperialism and how to use their own greed and short-sightedness to alleviate the communist movements and make them stronger. And for the exact same reason, the Soviet Union was still maintaining relations with the nationalist China in order to form the unified front and save the Chinese communist movement from a war on two fronts, from the Japanese imperialism and from the nationalist regime of Chiang Kai-shek. So back to the topic of the Baltics. By June of 1940, the general strike starts in all three Baltic states, because the Baltic communist parties were working very strongly with one another. And soon the Baltic regimes were forced into retreat. The workers blocked off many major roadways, so the Baltic regimes could not use the army to suppress all these strikes and protests. And soon after, the army declared neutrality, and they even disarmed all these nationalist paramilitary groups. So basically, the nationalists were screwed, and they immediately petitioned for negotiations admitting defeat. So in Latvia, the fascist leader, Kārlis Ulmanis, he steps down as prime minister, but for some time retains the office of president. And he basically surrenders the cabinet, and the communists immediately form a popular government. And at the same time, the Soviet Union threatened the Baltic regime. So if you ever attack our bases, our soldiers, or open fire on the demonstrations for any reason, then we will intervene. So the nationalists were forced to step down. And soon the nationalist governments overthrow the fascist presidents in all Baltic states and proclaim the restoration of the constitution, of all democratic liberties, restore the previous capitals' constitutions, and declare new elections to the newly formed People's Soviets. The communists in all three Baltic states win an overwhelming majority, and soon the Soviet-style governments are proclaimed. So all these previous pro-capitalist structures are completely abolished, and many people who were far from politics, they're all involved, and many people join the Communist Party. And right after the collapse of the French Republic, after the Germans conquered the Benelux and France itself is a very interesting topic because effectively there was a fascist coup d'etat, a fascist conspiracy, and the Popular Front government was toppled in France. And this allowed the Germans a very, very easy victory in France because all these fascist elements in France immediately petitioned to capitulate. But that's a whole other topic. So realizing the danger that Germany presents, that it can invade the Baltic states at any time, the Baltics, the new popular Baltic governments petitioned to the Soviet Union to be admitted as full members of the Soviet Union. And this request is finally granted after around 2 months in early August. After the admission of the Baltics, a series of very popular reforms take place. The principal of them is the agrarian reform. So up until then, huge chunks of land belonged to these kulaks, so huge landowners and great barons, as they were called here in Latvia. They controlled huge swaths of land. They had connections to the capital's government, and they basically ran the whole thing. And the most popular demand was the division of land, so that these small and medium peasants could finally work the land without the fear of going bankrupt, without all these oppressive taxes. So the new Soviet Latvian government does that, and it leases them money and equipment at very, very low rates. Another reform that the Soviet government does is the nationalization, what we prefer to call the popularization of industry. So the industry becomes owned by the people, by the populace. And all these former factory owners, supporters of the regime, are forced to relinquish their claim, and the workers become the rightful masters of their own house, as the Chinese comrades said. This is very, very popular, but at the same time, the capitalist resistance was growing because obviously the capitalists did not expect this quick defeat in 1940. So many of the fascist supporters, all of the nationalist supporters, and there were 10,000s of them, they immediately went underground. They started working with the reactionary governments, most often Nazi Germany, in order to carry out acts of sabotage, in order to destroy the economy and the defenses of Latvia, preparing for the upcoming invasion. And it is estimated that before the German invasion, there were around 60,000 hardcore nationalist supporters in Latvia that were organized into these pro-Nazi and fascist groups. And they were ready to strike at any time, whenever the green light was given from Germany.
I was just going to ask, so as we see in a lot of other states that were either in and a part of the Soviet Union or in its periphery, there's this not newer, but I think to more Western audiences and American audiences, revisionist history that's been building and building and building since the fall of the Soviet Union. And even before that, that kind of lionizes those fascists as resistance fighters, things like that. How has that looked in Latvia? And we can even maybe touch on this later as we get closer to more modern history. But I can imagine that the state as it exists now and the people that want to continue this fascist move forward probably talk very poorly about how well communism was regarded in this time and the quick joining to the Soviet Union and all that. Like how is that portrayed these days by the Latvian government and the people?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question, because basically we are the epicenter of this historical revisionism, and the position that you mentioned the aggressive historical revisionism, it is the official stance of the current Latvian nationalist government. And de facto, it is the only legal view that you can hold without consequences, because any attempt to do a serious historical analysis or anything that you say that portrays the Nazi sympathizers as they really were, Nazi sympathizers, it is punishable by law, because it is illegal to say things like that, and they are punished as, I think it's called, the justification of war crimes. That's one law. Another law is the justification of crimes against humanity committed by totalitarian regimes. By that, they mean the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, but the Nazis are never, ever punished by this law.
Never.
Yeah, of course, only the communists.
Of course.
And another law, I think, it is the inciting of hatred. So you're prosecuted using a variety of laws if you try to do a serious historical analysis. And what they're doing right now, they're calling everything that is Soviet-related, that happened in 1940, that happened after 1945, as Soviet occupation. That is their official stance. And this originated in the 1950s. And the first fraudulent essays on this Soviet occupation, they were published in the 1950s by the exiled Nazis who were working in the Ostland administration. Ostland was the Nazi administration in the Baltics. So they fled in 1944. They settled in the United States, Canada, and West Germany, many of them in Sweden too. And they started immediately pushing for this revisionist history in order to whitewash their cooperation with the Nazis and in order to portray themselves as these principal opponents of both Nazi-style fascism and Soviet communism.
Just like the OUN in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Because it was the same playbook that is used by the bourgeois ideologues. And by the 1980s, when all these class enemy and bourgeois politicians in the Soviet Union basically assumed complete control, all of these emigres, all these emigrated fascists, they started coming back. First using cultural exchange programs as cover in order to spread their fascist views. And after a while, they start entering the government, all these parallel nationalist governmental structures. And in 1990, 1991, they basically overthrow the Soviet government and assume complete control. So this pro-Nazi regurgitation of fake history became the official stance of the current Latvian government. And anyone who says otherwise will be either ostracized, fired from their job, especially if they hold an administrative job or job in the education. And at worst, they will be prosecuted and put behind bars. So basically, stating true history, revealing the crimes of local Nazi collaborators is now a felony. It's a full-blown felony, and that is why, that's how difficult it is. And it became even more difficult after 2022, because even mild government dissent is enough to basically get you into some serious legal trouble. So that is why here in the Baltics, almost no one here acts under their real name. We have to use assumed names, pseudonyms, and we have to be very, very careful when discussing these topics. And even what I'm discussing with you now, I'm sort of forced to be very careful because I cannot state many things openly because of that, because of the podcast. In private, yes, I could tell you a lot more, but even here I have to practice caution.
Okay.
Sure.
And now, a word from our sponsor. As we all know, getting on a plane is more dangerous than ever. Formerly respectable and trustworthy airlines have become corrupt, and the industry as a whole is devolving into disarray. For me, when selecting an airline, I don't want a newcomer to corruption. I want an expert. That's why I turn to Air Baltic. The oligarchs at Air Baltic are a veritable who's who of white-collar criminals, transport ministers, mayors, and prime ministers. Oh my! Air Baltic might not offer lavish lounges or free champagne, but they include a laundry service for your money. That's why if you sign up for Air Baltic's Scandal in the Skies program today, you'll receive a lifetime supply of airline miles that may or may not be redeemable. And remember, kids, screw the president, screw the government, and punch the prosecutor in the throat, allegedly. And now, back to the show.
And so then to bring it back, you said that there were estimated 60,000 fascist sympathizers in Latvia. For context, is that like, what, a quarter of the population, or what would it have been as far as numbers?
Well, when you look at Latvia's population as a whole, which was slightly under 2 million in 1941,
so it's like 5%.
This is it's quite a huge number, because they also had their family members, which more often were also sympathizers. And you have to remember that these guys were hardcore fascists. They were in the nationalist movement for more than 20 years, and many of them held very important administrative roles under the fascist tyranny of Kārlis Ulmanis. So they had administrative experience, they had ideological experience, and many of them had direct handlers from the Nazi intelligence, the Abwehr, who were training them, who were coaching them, and relying on their knowledge in order to create a collaboration authority once the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. So 60,000 was a huge number for Latvia, or the Baltics as a whole.
And there's there's a trend amongst these like far right nationalists where they are, they don't want outsiders to influence the development of their nation that they originate from, but in every single instance in which they are losing, they turn to imperialist powers to help them. It happened with Petliura under the 1918 to 1921 nationalist government in Ukraine. It happened again with the OUN in Ukraine under Stepan Bandera. This is like it just keeps happening. Like they look to imperialists to bail them out when they're losing. When they're winning, they're fine with, these are our borders and we don't want outside influence. But when they lose, they turn to imperialists every time.
Oh, yes, that is a very good observation, because we, with our Russian comrades, with other Baltic comrades, we made the same observation. And the Russian comrade who couldn't connect it today, he put it very well, that nationalism has nothing to do with the actual nation. Even the nation itself is a bourgeois concept, because it originated in the 18th, 19th century, and nationalism basically describes the rule of the bourgeoisie within the confines of their own country. And today, nationalism has nothing to do even with the bourgeois concept of a nation, because nationalism seeks to sell the country to imperialism, to anyone with a buck, to the highest bidder. And the nationalists always do that, because what really unites them is the class solidarity, because they're bourgeois by their nature. And the nationalists, who are slightly lesser part of the bourgeois, they will always sell their country to their class allies.
Petliura literally sold the topsoil of Ukraine to the Austrians. Literally millions of tons of topsoil.
Yeah, just like they did today with the Ukrainian black soil.
Yep.
So the nationalists would always sell their country in order to guarantee their own meager existence, even as puppets, because they understand that it's either that or losing everything to socialism, to communism. So they're ready to become the lowest of the slaves, the lowest of imperialist servants and whores, just to maintain even a tiny sliver of their private property. Even when they're relegated as puppets who only receive crumbs, they will always choose that over dignity and over socialism, because a bourgeois would never agree to an honest day's work, because that's what they are. That's what a bourgeois is, because they're afraid of responsibility, they're afraid of honesty, they're afraid of honest work. So they will gladly sell their country even to someone like Hitler.
Yeah.
So returning to the topic of the Nazi invasion, so 60,000, it is a lot. It is basically an entire army, just waiting to be mobilized, just waiting to be engaged. And another important topic is the length of the socialist revolution, because the Second Latvian Soviet Republic, until that point, has existed for slightly less than a year. And you can imagine how narrow of a time frame it is. So basically, there was no way to quickly deal with all these nationalist and fascist elements that still remained. Yes, they were fired from their job. They were forced into honest factory and farm jobs. but they were still there. Their bourgeois mentality was still there. Their old world mentality still persisted. And because there was virtually no bloodshed, the socialist revolution in the Baltics in 1940 was basically the best case scenario of a socialist revolution. The workers, with their overwhelming power, managed to destroy the capitalist government without the situation descending into a civil war, which is basically the best outcome we need to strive for. And because of that, we didn't have enough time to root out all of these capitalist elements, because you could do that with re-education, with work practice, without all this massive bloodshed of a civil war. And the capitalists are always pushing for a civil war because that's the only thing they can do when they're losing. And the Baltic nations were heavily counting on the Nazi intervention. And that is why they had enough power to stage the scene for another counter-revolution that would happen in June and July of 1941. So on June 21st, 1941, the Nazi forces invade. The Baltics are invaded by the Army Group North from Russia and Poland. And despite the valiant resistance of the Red Army, the overwhelming pincer of the Army Group North steadily cuts through Lithuania. And in just 1 week, the Nazi forces already reached Riga. And it was quick. And because of that, many of the factory workers and many good comrades could not evacuate in time. They were left behind enemy lines. And so the Nazis reached most major cities in Latvia within a week. But many towns, such as Riga itself, Liepaja, and Daugavpils, hold on for another week. The communists, the communist youth organizations, and the remaining forces of the Red Army organized some really tight defenses around Riga in order to stall the advance of the Nazi forces to Estonia and obviously Leningrad. And so the Nazi invasion of Riga is delayed for another week. And after the Nazis managed to cross the Daugava River south of Riga, then the remaining communist forces have to retreat in order to prevent a complete encirclement. And the forces in Liepaja, which is a very, very important port city, the ice-free port that hosted a very sizable chunk of the Soviet Baltic fleet, it holds for another 2 weeks. So the heroic defense of the port city, of the harbor city of Liepaja, is very well known. And after 2 to 3 weeks, all of Latvian territory is occupied by the Nazi troops, and roughly 5,000 to 6,000 Communist Party members are left in Latvia. The Latvian Soviet Republic didn't have very much time to recruit and train new communists in their ranks. And because of that, the total membership of the Communist Party of Latvia by 1941 was less than 10,000 people. And most of these people were left behind enemy lines because the Nazis approached quickly. The internal counter-revolutionary resistance was also very stiff. So once the Germans invaded, the Nazis basically staged an uprising and managed to capture several smaller towns. They managed to capture some of the roads, which helped the Germans advance quicker. And many of the deserters and bourgeois elements in the Red Army itself, as sad as it was, also sabotaged very important mobilization efforts. And because of that, a lot of the forces in the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic were not mobilized in time. So a lot of people were left behind enemy lines, and the Nazis and their local nationalist henchmen started a very, very fierce regime of oppression. And many people were captured in the first weeks of the Nazi invasion. They were put behind bars, and many of them were shot. So in 1941 alone, roughly 5,000 to 10,000 people were already apprehended by the Germans and their nationalist henchmen, mostly Communist Party members and anyone suspected of anti-Nazi activity. The resistance movement in Latvia and the Baltics as a whole was very different from that in the rest of the Soviet Union, like Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and the Caucasus, because we had a very strong anti-communist movement already existing. The Nazis managed to capture the Baltics relatively quickly, and there were also a lot of Communist Party members left behind the enemy lines. And it was very hard to establish contacts between the general staff and the Red Army itself. And all these communist groups in Latvia, they were pretty isolated. And the reason for that was the oppression. The thing is that under circumstances like this, it is very hard to form large groups because it makes them much more susceptible towards infiltration. So there were many reports and records made by the Nazis that large groups were captured in 1941. For example, groups of more than 20 people, more than 30 people. They were captured very quickly. And because of that, the communists had to rapidly shift their tactics and split into smaller groups, as little as 3 to 5 people, just to remain covert. Because the local nationalists were eagerly serving the Germans, and they would always try to infiltrate the communist partisan groups as provocateurs and spies in order to spy on their activities, in order to surrender the members to the Gestapo. So it was very difficult. And they had to adapt basically the same tactics that they used when fighting against the Tsarist oppression some 40 years ago. So that's what they had to do.
So in Ukraine, when the nationalists reasserted themselves after a socialist victory, Jewish people bore the brunt of retaliation against civilians. Was this the case in the Baltics as well, or was this isolated to Ukraine because of its particular character as part of as the main bulk of like the pale of settlement, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And the nationalists were trying to avoid this for this exact reason, because the Holocaust in the Baltics was just as fierce, if not even more fierce than it was in Ukraine, because here the first death camps opened and virtually all of the Jewish and Romani people in the Baltics were exterminated by the Nazi henchmen. So they were so bloodthirsty, they were so cruel that even the Nazis themselves were appalled at this brutality.
Yeah.
Because just like with the Western Ukraine, we had 20 years of bourgeois nationalist terror. And a lot of people were subjected to the nationalist propaganda, which also contained a lot of anti-Jewish elements. And by 1940s, it was very difficult to combat this anti-Semitism because it was promoted by these nationalist governments, and it was very hard to deal with it. And the Baltics as a whole had a very high Jewish community relative to the population. In Latvia, a country of roughly 2 million people, we had 70 to 75,000 Jews in total. And in Lithuania, more than 300,000. So Lithuania was one of the centers of the Jewish community in Northern Europe. And Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, was nicknamed the Northern Jerusalem because more than half of its population was Jewish. And more than 95% of all these people in the Baltics, they were exterminated. And it was very gruesome. I would not recall everything because it's just so difficult to talk about.
Sure.
As soon as Nazi uprisings and the Nazi invasion started, the nationalist henchmen immediately started singling out and exterminating their Jewish neighbors, rounding them up, locking them in barns, in synagogues, and setting them on fire. The most infamous one is the Riga Choral Synagogue fire, where more than 300 people, many of them were refugees from Lithuania who were fleeing the Nazis. They were locked in the synagogue, and the synagogue itself was set on fire, and the whole thing was filmed by the Nazi newsreel, and you can actually find it. It was filmed. The remaining synagogues were also burned, and some of the buildings, synagogues that were in old town sections, instead, they were turned into stockpiles because the fire would spread to other structures. So the Nazis simply converted them into stockpiles or barns or something like that. And in smaller towns, similar massacres happened. All these pro-fascist people started outing their Jewish neighbors, and they started killing them. And there were a lot of killing pits near these settlements. And in Latvia, almost whenever you go to almost any town, you would find a Jewish cemetery, and there is a memorial stone that is dedicated to the victims of Holocaust, because almost every single Jewish community in Latvia, Lithuania, in Estonia was completely wiped out. And by late 1942, the collaborators, the nationalists, were so cruel, so effective in their bourgeois psychopathic killing spree that Estonia was labeled as Jew-free by the Germans, because the Estonian nationalists killed every single Jew living in Estonia.
Jesus.
Fuck.
Jesus.
So I wanted to make this point. It's not exactly related to what you just said here, but I did want to say that I've appreciated, as you've kind of brought us through this talk, that you've indicated that one of your comrades suggests calling this conflict the Great Patriotic Class War and viewing it as this extension of the October Revolution itself. Typically, we're taught that World War II is, a fight between the Axis powers and the Allied powers. But really, what was occurring was it wasn't just a military conflict, it was a revolutionary phase across the world. Say, for example, the destruction wrought by the start of World War II really just destroyed everything, but allowed for an opportunity for something new to be built in its place. I know in some places across Europe, right, the owners of capital, like, they would just bounce, they'd peace out, and people would just be now left in their villages, now with the means of production for the first time within their control, and, no one necessarily telling them exactly what to do. So I think that's a very important thing for us to understand when thinking about World War II, is viewing it as more than just this conflict, but a revolutionary period in which things are happening across the world, and there's a class confrontation, which, I guess that we haven't seen since that's happening at that time.
Yeah, that is very important because the capitalist authorities all over the world in their education systems, if you can even call it an education, they're trying to wash out all of this class conflict elements, all of these things related to class struggle, because they understand as soon as people start viewing all these historical events from the class lens, it is truly over. Because if you look at all these resistance movements, anti-fascist movements, the most principled ones, the most successful ones, the most organized ones were always communists, no matter which country you look at. In Germany, if you read about the anti-Nazi resistance, the vast majority of them were communists who organized all of these affiliated groups and even non-party affiliated groups into something bigger, because they laid the groundwork for this lasting victory over fascism. And basically, all these anti-Nazi communist fighters in Germany, they basically vindicated the German people, because they showed that the German people, in principle, will resist fascism. And not only it's an important historical and psychological element, it also shows you the importance of this international proletarian solidarity, because any worker from any country, from all over the world, is much, much closer to you than the capitalist at home. If we look at France in 1940, the ones who proposed the general defense plan for Paris and the defense plan of the whole country, it was the Communist Party of France. And that is why the fascists sabotaged the defenses of the French. And basically, how Stalin described it, they basically placed the entire country at the feet of the Germans. That's what these fascist saboteurs did in France, because the communists were ready to fight it. They had a plan, and with the amount of French forces that were still left, even though the Nazis were closing in on Paris, they still had to fight an army of 500,000 men. And the communists were ready to lead that fight. They were ready to organize this huge army. But the capitalist class of France, fearing for a socialist revolution, feared that and basically surrendered the whole country to the Nazis. And you can see that in Yugoslavia, where the capitalist elements basically surrendered and allowed the Nazi invasion to happen. The same way how it happened in Romania and Bulgaria. And in all these countries, communists were the first to carry the fight and carry it to the fascists themselves. So the fascists were facing mounting resistance within their own borders, and the same applies to the Baltics. So we had to segue back to the topic of Baltics. So by the end of 1941, despite a series of arrests and executions at the hands of the German fascists and their local henchmen, the Latvian underground movement persists, and it continues to recruit people, but it has to act in very small groups. For example, one of the biggest communist organizers in Riga, Arvids Rentnieks, unfortunately, he was captured, and for some time, the communist activity shifts to the east of the country. So the province, in the easternmost part of Latvia, and the most diverse one, is called Latgale, or Latgalia, or Inflantia. So this is a very mixed territory, population-wise, because it has Latvians, Russians, Belarusians, the Latgalians, the Poles, and it has a very mixed religious identity as well. So there are many Catholics, the Orthodox people, Old Believers, Protestants, a lot of Jewish people before the war. So it was very mixed, and it mostly consisted of swamps and forests. So it was very good for preparing a communist partisan movement. And it was also right next to Belarus and Russia, where partisan movements were already very established. So this area was known as the partisan country because of just how common the partisan activity was. And up until recently, there was a huge monument at the tri-border junction of Latvia, Belarus, and Russia that was called the Kurgan of Friendship. And the Latvian side was demolished last year by the nationalists. And this spot was very important because the partisan veterans and their descendants, their sons, and all of the supporters would gather at this area. And you can see people from the other side. So people gathered there. They had all these memorial events related to the partisan struggle. But last year, the Latvian fascists demolished the monument, and they declared this area a border zone. So you can't even go there without a special permit. And they did that on purpose.
Yeah.
So back to the topic of resistance. The resistance was growing. And after a while, the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the military high command of the Soviet Union finalized a plan to reactivate the communist movement in the Baltics. A lot of people, a lot of very experienced comrades were sent back into the country. All of them were volunteers. They volunteered to cross the front line, go into the enemy rear, and reorganize the partisan resistance movement because they could carry fresh news with them. They could pass the orders of the central command. They could create a unified, organized command structure for the partisans. And most importantly, they could agitate all these seemingly neutral people, all these people that were too afraid, too terrorized to join the communist movement. Because unlike many cities, Riga was not properly evacuated. So for most cities, the Soviet high command managed to evacuate most of the factory workers, who were then relocated to safer spots in Kazakhstan and Siberia to work on all these military ordnance factories. But for Riga, it didn't happen. And in Riga, you had more than 100,000 workers still there. And you had to agitate these workers. You had to influence them because this was your main driver force of the revolution of the partisan movement. It was right there. In Riga, it was suffering under the brutal Nazi occupation because they had meager rations, less than, 1,400 calories a day per man. They had to work for 10 hours a day. They were constantly beaten and harassed and abused by the German invaders, and that's where you needed to work. And because of that, Riga was the most important part of the partisan struggle. And another important thing is that Riga hosted a whole slew of Nazi agencies and Nazi authorities for the whole Baltic region, because this imperial commissariat of Ostland, it was headquartered in Riga. And all of these governorates and all these prefectures, they also had their headquarters in Riga, the local headquarters of the army command, the local headquarters of the intelligence and counterintelligence, the local branch of the Nazi party, the Baltic branch of these fake Nazi labor unions. All of this was headquartered in Riga. So that is why this city had truly strategic importance. So both political, ideological importance, and geographical importance, because it was right in the middle of the Baltic Basin. And like I told you before, it was the springboard for the invasion of the Soviet Union and Russia. So that's why the partisan movement of Latvia shifted their attention to Riga. So in 1942, a new sort of unified command structure is created, and big three partisans emerge who led their partisan armies. So it was Iman Sudmalis. He was a member of the Communist Youth, and he was defending the port city of Liepāja. And after it was taken over by the Germans, he crossed the front line several times in order to carry news, correspondence, and army orders. And he was de facto head of the whole partisan network in Latvia. So Iman Sudmalis here is synonymous with the word, a fighting man, a honest man, communist, a true communist. So he was pivotal in communist organization, in the communist partisan movement. And up until recently, there was a monument erected in his honor. There were many monuments at the border junction area. They demolished it in the city of Liepāja, and many, many streets were named after him because it was a household name, basically. When you said Iman Sudmalis, you meant hero, to be like him, to be as heroic as him, to be as intelligent as him, to be as resourceful as he was, because that's what true humanity really needs, to be someone like him. Another really, really huge partisan leaders were Ottomars Oškalns. He died shortly after the war. Iman Sudmalis, Ottomars Oškalns, and Willy Samsons. Willy Samsons lived the longest out of the three. He died in 2011. And unfortunately, after the counter-revolution, he basically was locked into his house because he was getting harassed all the time. And he had to keep a very, very low profile. He refused interviews for a reason. And he basically lived in his home near Riga, and that's where he died, and that is where he is buried. So, yeah, those were the big three. So they had, in order to create an organized partisan structure in Latvia, which could be pretty centralized, but at the same time, the groups would be impenetrable for the Nazi counterintelligence and nationalist provocateurs. So the way it worked, that you had a very small street group, so to speak, the group that fought on the ground, which consisted of only 3 to 5 people. So in the countryside, it was the partisan group who actively engaged the Nazi forces. And in major cities, it was the underground resistance group, which spread propaganda leaflets, which sabotaged factory work, which sabotaged important roads and train lines, and also spread anti-Nazi views and agitated workers, both using leaflets, underground newspapers, and word of mouth. These smaller groups were led by their leaders, who also gathered in very, very small groups of 3 to 5 people. So if you go several levels up, you get to the highest command structure of the partisan movements. And once again, this was important because the Nazis always tried to infiltrate these groups, using all these nationalist spies, using their own spies sent over from Germany. So it was very important to remain hidden in order to remain under the radar, so to speak. So like I said, it mirrors the tactics used by the anti-Tsarist resistance during the revolution of 1905 and the revolution of 1917. So the propaganda work, the work against the Nazi invaders intensified, and even the German intelligence in their reports, they had to admit that the resistance in the Baltics was getting more and more successful and that it threatened to spill over into other regions, such as Estonia and Lithuania. And the German reports cited all of these people that I mentioned in the reports that they were very, very active, and that the German high command, the Nazi command, was getting more concerned about it. And I will talk a bit more about Imants Sudmalis. So he was the youngest of the 3. He was only in his 20s when he started doing agitation and propaganda work. He was arrested several times in the 1930s by the nationalist regime, and he was released when the fascist regime was toppled in 1940. And as soon as the war started, he began fighting. He began organizing all these partisan units, and he became effectively the leader of the whole partisan movement. And his task was to unite all of these partisan movements. In 1943, he was sent to Riga in order to organize the underground resistance in Riga. Because Riga was so important, the Nazis paid very high attention to this city in order to prevent the growth and spread of the partisan movement in Riga. And he was sent there, and in my opinion, this was sort of a mixed decision because, yes, it is important for him to organize it, but at the same time, Imants Sudmalis was engaged in a lot of fighting, a lot of struggle on the street, so to speak. And he was very close to all of these actions, armed actions against the Nazis, and this put him at unnecessary risk, unfortunately. And by 1944, he almost succeeded at creating this unified Riga partisan organization. But at the same time, he had to prepare an attack against the Austrian leadership. The Austrian leadership, after a string of defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk in late 1943, was staging a huge demonstration at the very heart of Riga. And Sudmalis' objective was to kill all of the Austrian leadership in one blow. And the Latvian partisans decided to do that using explosive ordnance that they wanted to activate when the leadership shows up. Unfortunately, the blast occurs ahead of time, and the Nazi leadership in Oslo manages to flee. And Imants Sudmalis tried to avoid Nazi pursuit, but unfortunately, he was turned over by a traitor. And in 1944, unfortunately, he was tortured and killed by the Nazis. And he was very close to creating this unified command structure for the resistance movement. And after his death, it was sadly a very huge blow for the Latvian communist movement because he was one of the most effective, if not the most effective, anti-Nazi partisan out there. And he was awarded the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor you could get. And many monuments were erected in Latvia and elsewhere, and many streets were named after him. Unfortunately, the Nazis that are roaming free in the Baltics are trying to erase that history. They're trying to perverse it. They're trying to frame the Soviet partisans, and especially Imants Sudmalis, as a terrorist because they understand what he really represents, because he represents the people and the true popular struggle. So in 1944, the communist movement was gaining ground, but the German fascists were trying to latch on to the Baltics as best they could because this region was indeed strategic. And after a string of defeats in 1944 and the start of the summer strategic offensive, the Operation Bagration, the Nazis were getting pushed back seriously in Belarus, Lithuania, and the Baltics. And after the astonishing success of the Red Army, the well-deserved success, very well-planned offensive, the whole Army Group North was locked in the Baltics, in Estonia and Latvia. They managed to escape encirclement in Riga, and after some heavy fighting, by October, the remaining Nazi forces managed to set up a defensive position in Kurland, the westernmost part of Latvia. And this area became known as the Kurland Pocket, or the Kurland Pot, where the remainder of the Army Group North was situated. And the Latvian partisans were successful enough that they managed to foil the Nazi resistance plans, because the original Nazi resistance plan was to stay in Riga and defend it at all costs. And when that failed, when the Nazi position became untenable in Riga, they tried to blow it up, just like they did with Warsaw and just like they tried to do with Krakow in Poland. They tried to blow up and completely erase these cities from existence. And they tried to do the same to Riga, because once again, Riga held very deep cultural and historical relevance, because this city was founded in 1201. It is a very, very old city. And this city became the capital of the Riga Archbishop. And it was the center of the German Crusades and the German colonization of the Baltics. So it also held a very high significance for the Nazis. And when they realized their position was untenable, they tried to completely blow it up, blow everything up, blow up the old town, blow up all the factories, blow up everything they could. But the workers were already organized into resistance groups. They foiled this attempt. And more than 2/3 of the city survived thanks to their efforts, because they disabled all of these ordnance charges. They killed the German Nazi officers who were assigned to carry out the blast order. They killed all these engineers and blast officers. They disabled the explosives. They hid all this sensitive factory equipment. They smuggled it out of the factories whenever they could. And that way, most of the Riga was gladly saved by their efforts, by the efforts of the partisan movement. So most of the German Army Group North was locked in the Kurland Pocket, along with the nationalist collaborators. And in 1943, the Nazis started aggressively recruiting and then conscripting people from Latvia into these SS legions, Waffen-SS Legion. And all of these other auxiliary units, after a string of defeats. So they lost at Stalingrad, they lost at Kursk, and they wanted to employ a lot of the people from the territories that they captured in order to replenish their losses. You know, a very similar thing that the Americans did in Vietnam, the policy of Vietnamization. When they were losing badly, they relegated all the fighting to their local collaborators, and they started heavily conscripting the local population to do their bidding.
I have a question in regards to, so I'm assuming there were other partisans. So there are the Red Partisans, the Soviet Partisans, the Communist Partisans. Did they work with non-communists, or were they in conflict with them? What did that look like?
Yes, there were many non-communist partisans. They were called non-party members. So officially, they were not affiliated with the Communist Party, but they were still fighting all the same. And a lot of people, they simply volunteered. Even though they were not members of the Communist Party, they still volunteered for the struggle. Many of them were evacuated as factory workers, but they volunteered because they knew the language. They knew their home country. They knew how to act inconspicuously. So they volunteered to cross the border. And many people who were not affiliated with the party, they were still joining the partisans all the same, because even though they were not card-carrying members, they were communists in all other aspects, because that's what a communist, what a true patriot does, because we have a very logical way of looking at things. If you're a true patriot, if you truly love your country, you are a communist, because this means that you love all other freedom-loving people of the world, and you love humanity as a whole. That's what it really means to be human. Even all these social democrats, eventually they changed their ways in Latvia, many of them, and they joined the communist partisans, because everyone else who was not fighting against the Nazis, they were collaborators, they were stooges, they were spies, they were members of all these nationalist paramilitaries, and many of them were actually sort of sleeper cells employed by the Nazis. So they were pretty discreet. And this brings us to the so-called Latvian National Committee that was formed by the Nazis in 1944. So when it became obvious that the Nazi defeat was just a matter of time, the Nazis tried to recruit all of these former right-wing social democrats, opportunists and former supporters of the nationalist regime. Those people who were very inconspicuous, for example, Gustav Stalmich, I think, and Otto Gustav. So they were right-wing social democrats who were very opportunistic. So first they tried to kind of supported the workers in the 1920s, but then they supported the nationalist crackdowns. They were kind of repressed in the 1930s at the time of fascism. And, they weren't changing their position all the time. So effectively, there were petty bourgeois elements. And they shifted and hesitated all the time. And many of them were recruited by the Nazis in order to act as these stooges and spies, in order to organize all these fake committees to draw attention away from the Nazis and other groups that openly collaborated with the Nazis. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's a very, very insidious tactic of infiltrating the liberation movement, hijacking the liberation movement, and trying to frame yourself as some sort of liberator. So when the Nazi defeat became inevitable, all of these petty bourgeois intellectuals and right-wing social democrats, they were on Nazi payrolls. How do we know that? From all these Gestapo and Abwehr archives and surviving data, the Soviet Latvian historians discovered that all of these people, they magically avoided punishment in 1941 and 42. Yes, these people were imprisoned, but their terms were very lax. They could see their relatives. They received all these prisoner benefits. They could buy things like cigarettes, newspapers, and whatnot. And even in concentration camps, they had a very, very lenient regimen. And these provocateurs, they were called honorary prisoners by the Nazis because they were used as spies, just like Bandera. He was in a concentration camp, but he was an honorary prisoner because he enjoyed all the perks and benefits that he could ever want. And then he was set loose, and he acted as a pro-Nazi agent in West Germany that coordinated all these Nazi efforts. And the same thing happened to the Lithuanian, the Latvian, and Estonian collaborators and all these covert nationalists. They were recruited by the Nazi. The Nazis imprisoned them to make them look like the victims of Nazi repression, and then they were let loose as these sort of not communist and not Nazi patriots, so to speak. And that's the legend that the Latvian nationalist government is pushing right now. They're pushing heavily for this Latvian National Council narrative because they're trying to frame them as this non-communist resistance group, even though it's complete and utter bullshit, if you excuse the language.
Yeah.
Because they were not fighting the Nazis in any meaningful way. They did not blow up any railway. They did not fight even a single Nazi policeman. They did not have any real meaning. The only way they had any meaning was disruptive. So they disrupted the communist agitation because they aided the Nazis in their disruptive work. They spread some very confusing and disruptive leaflets. They sabotaged this united partisan work. They tried to split, for example, the farmers, the peasants, and the intellectuals into abandoning communists. They tried to persuade them, they tried to confuse them, and they tried to infiltrate all of these groups in order to sabotage them from within. And after a while, this tactic proved successful in the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 1990s. So that's what they did. They expanded and perfected this infiltration tactic. And after a while, they tried to present themselves as both victims of Nazism and communism, but they were just really Nazis in disguise. And they tried to spread this historical revisionism that we talked about in the beginning of trying to equate the German fascism with the communist movement deliberately as a tactic of psychological and political sabotage. And for a while, they succeeded in the 1980s, 1990s, but right now, communism and socialism everywhere, it's making a comeback. It is very, very active in Russia. So basically, the people there are overwhelmingly communist, but they're just not organized enough. Even here, under this repressive atmosphere, socialist support and communist support is slowly coming back. It is very difficult. People are really afraid to speak their mind because of all the surveillance and all the stooges that reported people to the police. But we're slowly getting there. We're slowly growing. It is slower than elsewhere. It is slower than, say, in Russia and India, but it is still there. So socialism is making a comeback, and that's why they're making all these more and more repressive laws, because people read history and they're trying to find things out for themselves. So another important thing of the Baltic anti-Nazi resistance movement that the nationalists used is the scarcity of data. Unfortunately, we know very, very little about the Baltic and Latvian partisans compared to other areas like Russia, Ukraine, in Belarus because a lot of their exploits were not cataloged. Because of such heavy suppression, the communists had to act in very small groups here in the Baltics, and they could not leave any records behind because they know if you leave any records, this could be traced back to you. So a lot of this history is simply unknown. It was lost. Like I said, a lot of people, thousands of people, and by the end of the war, tens of thousands, roughly 30,000 partisans and their supporters and conscious workers, they were executed by the Nazis. And because of that, a lot of this information, a lot of these facts, a lot of this history was lost to us. And because Latvia was devastated so heavily by the war, Riga was actually the last Soviet capital to be liberated. Riga was liberated on October 13, 1944. So that's how late it was. We were under the Nazi boot for more than three years, which is very, very long. And because of that, we were focused on rebuilding. A lot of this information was not cataloged, and a lot of people who were alive in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, unfortunately, they died either of old age or their injuries and all the stress that they sustained, because many of these people were tortured in these concentration and death camps. A lot of people were injured in the line of duty when fighting in the partisan movement. And because of that, all of this priceless information was lost to time. And there was no centralized effort. And a lot of this research effort was also sabotaged by the fascist sympathizers that were still left in Latvia. Because, as you know, the so-called Forest Brothers were organized gangs of fascists and Nazis that remained in Latvia, that were trained by the Germans and then by the CIA, by the MI6. And they carried out these acts of terror. They killed all these experienced communist veterans and members of the Communist Party. They killed all of these families who knew the partisans. And because of that, this systemic work of collecting data, collecting all this history, it was not done. And only in the 1970s and 1980s, some serious efforts were undertaken by researchers to piece together all this extremely, extremely valuable information. One of the books that I'm reading right now is written by Jānis Dzintars. He was a very experienced researcher on the topic of the Latvian communist movement and the Latvian frontline divisions during the Great Patriotic War. He was a very capable, a very knowledgeable researcher, a member of the Communist Party, and he was fighting against the counter-revolution in 1991, and sadly he was exiled and he died in Moscow in 2008. And he wrote two seminal works, The Secrets of the Riga Underground and The Struggle of the Latvian People During the Great Patriotic War. So a lot of these things that we communists know is based on his research. And like I said, the information was very fragmented. So a lot of the key witnesses and key participants, they died, unfortunately. And a lot of this information was not even cataloged. And a lot of the prisoner files, a lot of the files and cases on partisan groups made by the Nazis, they were destroyed by them at the end of the war. So a lot of these documents were then spread out. So some of them were in the Soviet archives, some of them were the Polish archives, the East German archives, the West German archives, and as well as the US archives. So, for example, Jānis Dzintars had to travel all over the place and request all of this archival data just to piece together this information. And even now it's incomplete. And for example, in the English language, there's virtually no information about the Latvian communist movement. There's very little information, and the vast majority of it is taken over by the nationalists. The nationalist narrative in the English language sphere is very strong. They have a very strong lobby. There's a lot of these nationalist associations in Canada and the United States. They're pushing heavily for the nationalist line. They publish all this blood libel and smear campaigns against the Red Army and against the communist partisans. They spread this historical revisionism. And because of that, a lot of this priceless data is only available in the Baltic languages and the Russian language. And what we're trying to do here as communists is translating this work and just spreading word, just making sure that it is not lost, that people still remember it, that people learn on this memory, and that people employ this priceless knowledge and their class struggle of today and the future. And despite all this government repression, all this nationalist harassment, and indeed it is vicious harassment that we're experiencing, we still do not give up. And to their chagrin, we will never give up.
Hell yeah.
Yes, because otherwise it's either the socialist revolution or the death of the Latvian people, the death of the Lithuanian people, of the Estonian people, and many other peoples of the world. If you look at our demographic data, it is a true catastrophe. Our demographic losses since the counter-revolution of 1991, right now they exceed the number of deaths, the number of murders by the Hitlerites. We've lost almost 1 million people since 1990, and Lithuania lost 1.5 million, roughly speaking.
Jesus.
What they're doing right now, the imperialists and their fascist stooges here, they're nationalists, and they're doing everything to sell the country to imperialism, to destroy it, to enslave it, and sell it for profit. They're dismantling factories and sell them for profit. They sell all of our natural riches and resources for profit. And right now they're killing our people for profit and forcing them to emigrate and work for pennies abroad for profit, for their profit and for the profit of imperialism. And the only way to stop that is through communism. And we really mean that, because that is the only way to save our people. We need to stop their attempts to reignite even more wars like they did in Ukraine, like they're trying to do in Moldova, like they're trying to do even here in the Baltics, like they're trying to do this in the province of Taiwan, like they're trying to do in the Arab nations in Palestine, in Sudan, and everywhere else. We must resist that. Only communism can stop these wars.
Yeah, you mentioned communism is the answer. It is very, very easy for people who have been indoctrinated under capitalism being misdirected towards issues of immigrants or Jewish people or any ethnic minority or women or trans people or whatever, any of these things that have nothing to do with the causes of the problems that we have. When there is a terrorist attack, when there is some kind of an economic crisis, it is very easy for the people to turn to blame these people who have nothing to do with the crisis that we're facing. It's vital to give people a framework so that they can analyze, well, why did this happen? What was the underlying cause for this? And it inevitably comes back to capitalist, meddling of some kind, whether it's overproduction or whether it's, the need for cheap labor or whether it is any other factor that might lead to a crisis. But that's why it is vital to integrate ourselves amongst the people.
So that about does it for this episode. Thanks so much, Iskolat, and to all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. I'd like to specifically shout out our newest members, who are Kevin Lee, Connor, Elmoy, Kale Marks, Simon Steensig, Danonchka, Hannah, Kush, Hazen, Skladdy, Liquidated Bourgeoisie, Victor Williams, Aaron, Brad and Rooster, Comrade Callie, Danny Duplex, Alex D, Daniel C, Elastia Sisson, Joseph Morris, Inka White, Tristan Greeno, Bree. Thanks to all of you for being subscribers to one of our paid tiers on Patreon. So once again, if you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/Prolespod for free. If you have any questions, comments, or episode ideas, you can please email us at prolespod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all that fun algorithm stuff, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
They envision the entire world Sovietized communist style. Communist style. Communist style.